All right, I'm going to do my best to walk us through Module 29. So this is the Module 29 lecture. Things you may want is a copy of this PowerPoint can be found on LMS. Might also want the Unit 4, Section 5 packet that I handed out our last week of class. Unit 4, Section 5 of the book. Specifically, we'll be on page 18 and 19. But you will have to answer questions about this lecture for the homework this week. So anyway, Module 29 is about the loanable funds market. And just as a review, we need to mention, how do banks create money? Well, as we mentioned, banks create money when they make loans. So people deposit money at a bank. We call that a demand deposit, because when you deposit money at a bank, you are allowed to demand that money back. Based on how much you deposit, banks have to keep a certain percentage of this money. We call this the reserve requirement. The percentage of money they have to keep is called their required reserves. Any extra money that they have can be loaned out. We call this excess reserves, and this is how banks make money. They make loans on their excess reserves. So who supplies loanable funds? Well, the banks make the loans, but those loanable funds come from people or businesses saving money. If you are a person that puts money into the bank can now loan out funds. So you supplied loanable funds. Who demands loanable funds? Well, anyone that's looking to spend money. Businesses looking to expand their operations. The school, when we decided to build our campus, buy our campus. And the biggest entity that demands loanable funds is the government. Trump just announced he's going to do a stimulus package. We've already taxed everybody, so we don't have more money to spend. So the government is going to have to borrow money, or in other words, they're going to have to demand loanable funds. All right, just like always, we're going to build a supply and demand curve about the loanable funds market. Kind of a side note, but a formula you do not need to know. Kylan, you can pause this video as long as you want and write this formula down if you so choose, but you will not need to know this formula on the AP test. But simply put, we're talking about the rate of return. When we talk about the rate of return, we're talking about businesses' concept of whether they can make money off a project. If they borrow money, will they get more money back in the future to offset the cost of borrowing the money? So in essence, the rate of return dictates whether a company should undergo a certain project or not. If the rate of return increases, a company can therefore take on a bigger interest rate because they know that in the end they're going to make money back. If their perceived rate of return is low, then they wouldn't want to take on a loan with a high interest rate because they know that their project that they're doing won't pay for itself even. So the rate of return is the revenue from the project. So how much money will the project bring in minus how much is the project going to cost divided by the cost of the project. So we call that the rate of return. Again, you don't need to know that. You just need to know that if businesses think projects are going to return more money, they're more willing to take on a loan. So we're going to build this loanable funds market. It is a hypothetical market that examines the market outcome of the demand for funds generated by borrowers and the supply of funds provided by lenders. Their interaction will also help us determine the interest rate. If you remember in the other practice lecture I posted, the money market also determines the interest rate. So these two things play along together. In this model, we assume that there is only one market for lending and borrowing. People can only go to the banking system, which of course is not true, but we need it to be true for this model to hold true. And what we call the interest rate is the price for borrowing money. It's the price calculated as a percentage of the amount borrowed, charged by the lender to a borrower for the use of their savings for 1 year. If you remember over here on page 19, there's several interest rates we talk about. The nominal interest rate would be the rate that you go to the bank and the bank says, we're going to charge you 5% interest on this loan. That's the nominal interest rate. The real interest rate is whatever rate they say they're going to charge you minus the expected inflation. Because if you borrow $100, but you expect inflation to be 3%, when you give that money back at the end of the year, that money's worth less. So that's, in essence, you are spending the money when it's worth more. So we adjust for that by saying the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus the expected inflation. So as always, we build our curve. The demand, just like in every other curve we've done, the demand curve is downward sloping. Why is that? Well, if you remember, people that are demanding loanable funds are people looking to spend money. If the interest rate is 12%, it costs me a whole lot more money to borrow money. If the interest rate drops to 4%, I'm more willing to take on a loan. Think of that rate of return on business projects. If a business expects that some project is going to return 10%, they're not going to be willing to do this project if it costs them 12% to borrow this money. However, if it's only 4% interest rate, now their rate of return of 10% looks really good. They will only be charged 4% and their profit will be that 6% difference. But anyway, the demand for loanable funds is downward sloping because people are more willing to borrow money when the interest rate goes down. The cost of money has decreased. Conversely, if you're a person looking to save money, if the interest rate is 4%, you may not be that interested in saving money. However, if you can go to the bank and get 12% interest on your savings, you're going to be more than happy to do that. If you could get 12% interest rate back on your deposits, you'd be more than happy to do that. So the supply of loanable funds, remember, people that are willing to save money are supplying loanable funds. If they can get a bigger interest rate for their funds, they're more willing to do it. So how do we reconcile these two? Well, we see where they intersect, just like always. Where the demand for loanable funds meets the supply of loanable funds, it means that many loanable funds, we made up a unit here, $300 billion of loanable funds is equilibrium, and the equilibrium interest rate would be where those intersect at this hypothetical 8%. Again, we don't care so much about numbers as we do the process of analysis. So now we're going to talk about, as always, what are going to shift these two curves. And again, you can follow along over here on page 19 of your notes. The two things that shift the demand for loanable funds are change in perceived business opportunities. This has to do with that rate of return. If businesses are more optimistic, they think that their project is going to return more money than they thought before, they're going to be willing to borrow more, or in essence, demand more loanable funds. If businesses become pessimistic, right, they think that their projects won't return as much, they're going to be less willing to borrow money, to borrow loanable funds, so the demand will shift left. The most important one that you'll see in this class, and the one that's most commonly seen to shift the interest rate, is government borrowing. As I mentioned earlier, the government, Trump just announced a stimulus package. To fund this stimulus package, the government is going to have to borrow more money. By borrowing money, they are going to demand loanable funds. When they demand loanable funds, this drives the interest rate up. When this interest rate goes up, businesses are now unable to borrow at the same rate they were before. Because the government had to borrow money, the interest rate went up. When the interest rate goes up, businesses are unable to borrow. This stunts long-term economic growth, and we call this crowding out. Crowding out is when the government borrows more money, thereby increasing the demand for loanable funds, which drives up the interest rate, and it leads to reduced investment spending and consumption. When the government borrows more, people and businesses borrow less because the interest rate goes up. We call this crowding out. So over here, right, perceived business opportunities, when they're optimistic, the demand shifts right. When they're pessimistic, the demand shifts left. If the government decides to borrow more, the demand for loanable funds shifts right. If the government decides to borrow less, demand for money for loanable funds shifts left. Just as always, if we talk about a shift of the demand for loanable funds, we're talking about shifting this whole curve to the right. When the curve shifts right, the interest rate goes from here to there. Now there's two things that shift the supply of loanable funds. Change in private savings behavior and change in capital inflows. Now you and I are people that can supply banks with loanable funds. And for example, people according to the podcast we listen to, people are hoarding cash, which means we're saving less. People have decided they would rather have easy access to money than put it into long-term savings. As a result, the supply of loanable funds is shifting left. In general, they have to make this fairly obvious, but if people want to save more, for whatever reason, people want to save more, the supply of loanable funds increases. If people want to save less, hence what the podcast said, the supply of loanable funds will shift left. The other thing that will shift the supply of loanable funds is what we call capital inflows. Unfortunately, in this class, we'll not talk much about international trade. This is one of the sections that the AP test has decided to chop out of the AP testing this week due to the coronavirus. But the important thing is other countries supply a lot of the loanable funds. If American investments seem good to other countries, money will flow into the country. We call that a capital, as in money, inflow, as in into our country. So if there's something that's going on in America that causes other countries to want to invest here, the supply of loanable funds will increase if investment projects in a country are appealing. Conversely, if investment projects in a country are not appealing, they look bad. Right now, I don't know where money's going to flow because the global economy is not doing well. But I can't imagine people are wanting to invest in America right now because our investment opportunities don't seem great. So anyway, investment projects are not appealing. Other countries will pull their money out of our country. This would cause the supply of loanable funds to shift the other way. Again, a change in the supply of loanable funds will look like this. It will shift the whole curve. So now we're going to jump back to page 18. I'm going to do my best to walk you through this problem. So this is on page 18, one practice problem. In order to finance the increase in government spending on national defense, the government borrows funds from the public. Using a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market, show the effect of the government's borrowing on the real interest rate. I'm going to do my best. I don't know how this is going to work. You know what? I'm going to create a separate video.